Situated near the center of the Mediterranean's largest island, the site of Morgantina has been the focus of American and Italian excavations since 1955. And over more than 5 decades, archaeologists have unearthed an entire city, complete with a theater, agora, religious sanctuaries, and the houses of residents made wealthy by Sicily's fertile agricultural lands. Malcolm Bell has directed the Morgantina excavation since 1980. In addition to his long tenure as professor of classics at the University of Virginia, he was professor at the American Academy in Rome, Mellon Professor at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, and a visiting professor at the School of Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris. He is the recipient of numerous distinctions, and his research has been supported by grants from the NEH, the Mellon and Guggenheim Foundations. Professor Bell is the author of many dozens of studies on ancient Sicily, and since he took charge of Morgantina, over 150 books and articles have discussed the discoveries made at this important site. The most recent contribution to this impressive list of publications is that of our second speaker, Dr. Sandra Lucore. Dr. Lucore completed a PhD in classical archaeology at Bryn Mawr College in 1997 and has co-directed the excavations at Morgantina's North Baths since 2003. She divides her time between Sicily and Tokyo, where she has taught at the University of Tokyo and Tokyo Women's Christian University since 1996. Dr. Lucore is a specialist on the architectural and social aspects of bathing, a hallmark of Roman society, but as she will tell us, one that has roots in the refined culture of Greek Sicily. We are first to hear from Professor Malcolm Bell, who will introduce the site, followed by Sandra Lucore's presentation of recent research, and then a discussion led by my colleague Claire Lyons of the Getty Villa. So please join me in welcoming Professor Malcolm Bell and Dr. Sandra Lucore.
I want to thank David Bomford for his kind introduction and the Museum Council for the invitation and possibility of being here today. And we are certainly indebted to Carol White and to Claire Lyons for the invitation to speak about the archaeological site in Sicily, to bring just a little of the results. They're not exactly the first fruits of our excavation, which, as David Bomford said, goes back to 1955, but we hope also that they are by no means the last fruits. They are work in progress. And I want to thank the staff of the Villa for its extremely efficient welcome and assistance for us. And I also, at the beginning, should acknowledge the debt that we have to the Italian authorities who have made it possible for us to excavate at Morgantina, and in particular to architect Enrico Caruso, who is the new director of the archaeological park at Morgantina, which was created only this past fall. So that this is a major development, and we acknowledge architect Caruso's support and assistance. And I conclude only by saying these introductory remarks by saying that I owe a great deal to my colleagues. Any archaeological project is a collaboration, and it's very nice and very pleasing that some of my colleagues are here tonight, but I owe them a great debt for all they have contributed and contributed to our discussion, in effect, the conclusions that I want to draw tonight. Our topic this evening belongs to the early Hellenistic period, that is, to the Mediterranean world as it existed in the century after the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE. And all my dates this evening will be BCE, as one says today. Modeled on Alexander's Macedonia, The kingdoms established by his successors were now the dominant political entities. Largest were Egypt of the Ptolemies and Syria of the Seleucids, and slightly later, Attalid Pergamon emerged in Asia Minor. Our subject is the smallest and least known of the Hellenistic kingdoms, which had as its capital Syracuse, and which occupied most of eastern Sicily. Although the roots of the Syracusan kingdom extend back into the 4th century, the period that concerns us lies in the 3rd century, when Syracuse was ruled by an enlightened king, Hiron II. His reign began about 275 and lasted until his death at the age of 90 in 215. After an initial period of conflict in the 270s and 260s, with Rome and Carthage, the great powers that were gearing up for the Punic Wars, Hiron's rule at Syracuse was characterized by a half-century of peace. He was succeeded, and you see Hiron and his queen Philistus, and they are looking across at the rulers of Ptolemaic Egypt, Ptolemy I and Ptolemy III here below. Hiron in Sicily was succeeded by his grandson, who quickly became embroiled in the Second Punic War and was assassinated after a reign as brief as his grandfather's was long. In 212, Syracuse was captured and sacked by a Roman army, and with it ended an era of great cultural achievement that was not without influence on Rome. In the later Hellenistic period, corresponding to the 1st and 2nd centuries, corresponding to the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, as Rome's first province, Sicily became a backwater, and the island's culture under Rome became literally and figuratively provincial. Before the disaster of the Second Punic War, the situation had been different. 3 qualities seem to me to be characteristic of the Hironian era: complexity, innovation, and economic well-being, which all depended on peaceful conditions. Each of these structural ideas could be described with greater nuance. By complexity, I'm thinking of an emphasis on the interrelatedness of the parts of, say, an institution or a material thing like a building or a city. Innovation includes an interest in experimentation, and well-being would imply a concern for comfort and even luxury. In the political context, these qualities seem to be the consequence of rational policies appropriate to peaceful conditions. And indeed, rationality might be regarded as a 4th characteristic of the Hironian system, the Hironian administration. The king himself wrote a text on agronomy. He was a kind of George III, a kind of farmer king, and in this text he may have described his own agrarian reform. And Syracuse, in the time of the 3rd century, produced 2 of the greatest Greek intellectuals of the day. Early on, the poet Theocritus, inventor of the pastoral genre, and later Archimedes, the greatest mathematician of classical antiquity and an engineer of genius. The achievements of these 3 men exemplified the qualities of complexity and innovation that characterized the age, and their work could only have been accomplished during the remarkable half-century of Hironian peace. We know something of the political economy of Hiron's kingdom because Rome adopted his tax system and maintained it over all Sicily for more than a century and a half. Our knowledge of this legislation comes largely from the Roman statesman Cicero, who prosecuted a corrupt Roman governor, Gaius Verres, in the late 70s, and subsequently published his detailed indictment of Verres. Among the governor's many crimes was his exploitation of the tax system, hence the information that we have about it. The carefully devised Lex Hironica, or Law of Hiron, gave partial autonomy to the cities of the kingdom, each of which owed a tithe of grain production to the king. The fiscal regulations were characterized by checks and balances aimed at preventing both corruption on the part of the tax collectors and fraud on the part of the cities and farmers. Cicero praises the system for its fairness and reports that the king was much loved in his own time. In addition to the fiscal law, Hiron also instituted a common currency, a kind of predecessor of the euro. I suggest that the political economy of the kingdom exemplifies the sort of pragmatic innovation and complexity typical of the age. Sacked by Rome in 212 and exploited later by corrupt governors like Verres, Cicero lived on as a city and today still occupies the splendid ancient setting. While important monuments do survive, our knowledge of the material culture of the kingdom has been enriched by the excavations at Morgantina, conducted since 1955, largely by Princeton, the University of Illinois, and the University of Virginia, and Duke University is a recent sponsor. I should say at this point that the excavators of Morgantina believe that there is abundant archaeological evidence to argue that the city and its territory lay within the margins of Huron's kingdom, although no literary source tells us this. Morgantina is located just here on the edge of the kingdom, and you see the site in the slide on the right here looking out at Mount Etna, and this is a view of the center of the city. On the west, in the Huronian age, Morgantina occupied a relatively new site that had been laid out with a regular plan in the mid-5th century BC. This is the most recent version of our city plan, which shows the excavations, the center, and the grid that you see is the actual street grid, and the smaller squares are the house lots that were laid out at the moment of foundation. The high point in the city's history came during our period, and indeed the baths, the North Baths, which will be the topic of the second part of our presentation, lie out here on West 14th Street, West 14th and Avenue B. The names are ours, not the ancient names. We have some evidence to think that the ancient street names were named for deities, but we unfortunately have no street addresses that have brought down the names to us. But we have there are altars on the street corners, and we think that the names of the streets were named for heroes, deities, and other local divine and semi-divine figures. It was this prosperous and expanding place that fell to Rome in 211, a year after the fall of Syracuse. Handed over to a band of Spanish mercenaries, Morgantina survived as a small town until the 1st century of the Common Era, when it finally ceased to exist. Today, the site lies in the open countryside. Morgantina's agora, or public square, will introduce us to some characteristic features of Huronian Sicily. Immediately inside the South City Gate is a 300-foot-long public warehouse identified by Professor Eric Shirkvist of Princeton as a public granary. And that is the long building that you see here. This is the South Gate. Divided into several large rooms for the storage of cereals that must have included wheat, barley, and millet, this huge structure, which is called by the archaeologists the East Granary, is very likely to have been used for the storage of the tithe that was owed to Syracuse. It is thus one of the important exhibits arguing that Morgantina was indeed subject to Huron's system of taxation, and so part of the larger Syracusan administrative and political whole. Note that the East Granary at Morgantina is not aligned with the city's grid plan, but instead it's parallel to a smaller and older granary across the way, just here. And I will mention here that we will be re-examining the smaller West Granary this summer with the aim of establishing whether it belongs to an early phase of the Huronian period or is indeed even older, in which case the tithing system might go back before the period of Huron. We're hoping to gain dating evidence for it this summer. If the granaries denote the existence of a complex interurban political system, the careful citing of the East Granary also speaks of a new kind of urbanism. In our study of the agora of Morgantina, the public center of Morgantina, we have learned that most of the public buildings indeed belong to the Huronian age. And on the right you see the buildings in gray, including the theater, including the great flight of steps at the center, and that are of the 3rd century and can be dated to the reign of Huron. We've also learned that they were carefully sited in order to have visual relationships with one another. The aim was evidently to make the public center a coherent whole, both functionally and aesthetically. These intentional architectural relationships imply the existence of a comprehensive plan, which in turn is likely to have been adopted at one moment in time and to have been the work of a single designer. I think of him as the Syracusan architect, and it seems likely at least that he was sent to Morgantina from Syracuse, whatever his origin. Archaeological evidence argues that the plan was devised about 260 BC. Let us look at some of these relationships that I've alluded to. The key monument, indeed the keystone of the entire composition, is the great tripartite flight of 15 steps at the center of the space. And you see that in the plan just here. Here met the city's assembly, the institution that we commonly call the ecclesia, its meeting place, the ecclesiasterion. As it happens, this is another parenthesis, as it happens, Morgantina is not a city of Ionic but Doric origin. And in Doric cities, the assembly was not called the ecclesia, but the halia, and its meeting place, the haliacter. But I'm not going to insist on this arcane point because no one would know what the terms meant. So we shall stick with ecclesia and ecclesiasterion, even if they were not the terms that were used locally, because they are the accepted jargon. In an earlier time, the meeting place might have been constructed in circular form, and so have been unrelated visually to the surrounding buildings. Instead, the rectilinear flights allowed the planner to make the long west wing parallel to the facade of the theater, as you can see. Here, this is the west wing, and there is the facade of the theater, and you can see that clearly in the plan. And as you all can also see, the theater is not oriented according to the city plan, as the East Granary is not. The angle at which the west and central flights meet here, 135 degrees, is repeated in the terrace here of the east stoa, suggesting that they clearly were designed in relation to each other. The east stoa is a 300-foot-long portico that again follows the contour of the terrain and is not parallel to the city grid. Yet at the south, at the south end of the stoa here, you can see that the terrace in front is clearly related to the siting of the East Granary. All of these structures, stoa, granary, theater, and ecclesiasterion, open out toward the wider southern end of the Agora Valley, out here. When we reach the upper Agora, we can see that, once again, that the siting and dimensions of a major building, the North Stoa, were conditioned by the contemporary neighboring structures. This is the North Stoa, and the photographer here is standing on the end of that building there, just there, at the end of the North Stoa. The end of the North Stoa is, in fact, precisely aligned with the north end of the East Stoa, as you can see. It's just inserted directly into the arrangement of the buildings up there. And a similar coordination exists at the opposite end, and such relationships are typical of the Agora at Morgantina. Everything seems to be related to everything else. The widening of the Agora at the south indicates that our planner preferred to place the big new buildings in relation to the landscape and not align them with the rigid city grid. The Agora is thus theater-like, or theatroedes, to use the Greek term, and the stage is the distant landscape, and you get some view of that in the view on the right. 3 years ago, we were able to persuade the Sicilian authorities, after a long effort, to remove a good part of the old, I have to say, the old American excavation dump. We persuaded them, but they were undoing our work of the 1950s and 60s, to remove the dump, and you can see it being removed here, and this is the shadow of the dump up there in the dark, in order to restore the view to what it had been in antiquity. The city was, and still is, surrounded by wheat fields, which in antiquity were emblematic of the Hironian system and of its economic well-being, and they were visible clearly from the Agora, and we believe intended to be seen. Now, this kind of this is a view of from the end of the Agora, a view of the surrounding countryside, and This is taken in the early winter, but the green is all cereals, mostly wheat, growing to be harvested in June. The next slide is just a brief view of the theater at Syracuse, where you can see in the terrace up here, which is visible just there, that similar coordinated planning and of two long stoas, porticos, were planned in relation to the large theater. And so this kind of planning is typical of Syracuse, and we have a good example of it, an even more elaborate example of it in the excavations of the Agora at Morgantina. One of the Hironian buildings in the Agora strikingly exemplifies the qualities that I've been emphasizing, and we shall see that they're even more visible in the building that will be the subject of the second part of the evening's presentation. The building in the Agora is the Fountain House, which was excavated between 1982 and 1984, just here. And a couple of the excavators of the Fountain House are present this evening, I'm pleased to say. I think Professor Pena of Berkeley and also Sandra Lucore herself participated in that excavation. Now, water is a premium in central Sicily, and rainfall is not great and often insufficient. The design of the Fountain House is unusual. There are two large basins, an inner square one and an outer U-shaped one surrounding the inner one. The maximum capacity of the inner basin was 10,000 liters, and of the outer basin, 24,000 liters. Only the outer basin was accessible for dipping from an apron just outside its three sides. The fountain house remained in use for several centuries, and later changes in the water supply and architecture have obscured the original system. At the time of excavation, we believed that the main water source could only be a now dry spring rising behind the building. A dry spring is not something that's so easily identifiable on the ground, but we saw no other explanation for the filling of the basins, and so we posited the existence of the spring. We were later disabused of this idea by the geologist Sheldon Judson of Princeton, who visited Morgantina on several occasions and prepared a report on the site's geology. Professor Judson convincingly demonstrated that the geology of the Agora site would never have allowed a spring at this point. The answer to this conundrum has gradually become clear. The basins were filled at the start by rainwater, collected from the roofs of the fountain house itself and from the, even more important, the large east stoa just to the south. A sluice constructed of plaster runs along the side of the end of the stoa, and you can see the sluice just there in the plan, and it carried the rainwater from the roof of the east stoa into the back wall and then at least into the inner basin, possibly into the outer basin. While it's possible that water was also piped in via a terracotta conduit, the demonstrable use of the two roofs for rainwater collection indicates both knowledge of rainfall statistics and an interest in designing around the local ecology, the necessity of designing around the local ecology. Thus, the placement of the fountain house, not by a spring, as we originally thought, but by the huge east stoa. This is a view of the east stoa, and you see it there extending out. This is the fountain house, and the sluice that I'm speaking about is just there, running along the side of the building. The placement of the fountain house by the great east stoa, the roof of which has an area of more than 10,000 square feet, would have produced a very considerable quantity of water. The juxtaposition of these two buildings seems not just a characteristic Greek stringing of public buildings along the margin of an open space, like frogs around a pond, but a more considered decision based on the obvious need to provide water to the public sector of the city. We are preparing publication of the Fountain House now and are extremely aware of gaps in our understanding of aspects of its design, one of which regards the need for the inner basin, still unestablished. One function of the inner basin is at least clear. Its walls supported an unusual pavilion in the Doric order, elements of which were found at the bottom of the outer basin where they had fallen after an earthquake. And the earthquake can be dated, according to my colleague Shelley Stone, who is present here tonight, to the period of late Augustus or Tiberius in the first century of the Common Era. The Doric Pavilion helped support the roof of the fountain house and gave the otherwise functional structure an aspect of formal elegance. The Doric order is itself unusual, for the characteristic frieze of triglyphs and metopes is crowned not by the typical mutual ageison, which you see in a pure Doric building like the one here on the right. It's actually the Parthenon. It's crowned by an Ionic cornice, like the one that you see on the right, which shows you the order of the Theater of Marcellus in Rome. And you can see the dentils of the Ionic cornice. The mixed order is in fact typical of Hironian Sicily, where innovation trumped hidebound rules. The Roman architect Vitruvius would have thought it quite disorderly. And this is an example of the same order with the Doric frieze and the Ionic entablature in a silver altar that belongs to the treasure from Morgantina, which I'll have reason to allude to shortly. The early excavations at Morgantina brought to light several fine houses of the Hironian period. These document the emergence of a new middle class with an appreciation of domestic refinements such as dining rooms, painted wall decoration, and mosaic or terrazzo pavements. Nothing of the sort survives in this condition at Syracuse, where such large dwellings must nevertheless have been very common. Our houses permit me to introduce the theme of luxury, the third of the structural features which seem to me to be typical of Hironian Sicily. One of the decorated rooms in the house of Ganymede at Morgantina, which you see here on the right, and the room in question is room 14 there. One of the rooms contains a partially preserved pavement that belongs very early in the history of true tessellated mosaics, by which I mean pavements made with tesserae, the small stones with flat surfaces assembled to form either monochromatic or more decorative polychromatic floors. The date is probably not many years before the fall of Morgantina to Rome in 211 BC, perhaps around 225. Other mosaics in the same house appear to be older, and presently we shall see an early example from the North Baths, which may be considerably older too. In this period, true mosaics were also known in Ptolemaic Egypt, and instead of attributing the invention of the technique to a specific locality, I would prefer to see it as the achievement of individual artists who, like the poet Theocritus, may well have traveled. The mosaic in room 14 of the house of Ganymede was the centerpiece of a small dining room called a triklinos, or triklinon, and you see a reconstruction of it there on the right. The Latin triclinium, and in the Greek house, this was designed precisely for 3 clini, or dining couches, which are marked in gray on the plan on the right, on which would have reclined either 1 or 2 banqueters. Between 3 and 6 banqueters thus looked down at the mosaic over the axonometric meander frame, a carefully designed spatial construction that was a challenge to visual interpretation, especially as its proper viewpoint does not correspond to the position of any of the drinkers. And the drinkers would have been one of them here, the host, another looking at the thing from this angle, another here looking at it here, and so that the point of correct vision is back here in the corner where the V, you see the V points toward it. And you can see that it's a construction that's really meant to be seen only from that point. It's consistently rendered all around all 4 sides. Its proper point of view does not correspond to the position of any banqueters. In any way, the diners will also have been challenged by drink. At the center of the figured scene, lifted aloft by the eagle of Zeus, Ganymede floats against a dark ground surely to be red as sky. Attracted by Ganymede's beauty, Zeus has sent his eagle to seize the shepherd boy and take him to Olympus, where he will become the wine server of the gods. A clever subject, then, for a banqueting room. As an object of desire, Ganymede is also a suitable subject for a sympathetic space, a drinking space, where Eros was usually worshipped. And in his guide as shepherd, Ganymede alludes to the importance of herding animals in the Sicilian interior. In this very early mosaic, we can sense something of the excitement created by the parallel emergence of a well-to-do social class and the discovery of a new art form. Mosaic floors like this one will be laid down all around the Mediterranean for the next 600 years, but seldom with the subtlety of the floor in the House of Ganymede. The relationship of picture and frame in the Ganymede mosaic reappears in the most remarkable of the 16 pieces of silver that were repatriated to Italy by the Metropolitan Museum of Art last year. They went on view at Morgantina in December, this past December. They had been excavated clandestinely in the 1980s and were sold on the Swiss market to the museum. Thanks to the strong support of the Sicilian authorities, the U.S. project at Morgantina was able to excavate the house where the silver treasure had been looted. The vase in question is this one, and this is the center of the vase that originally was placed in the bottom of the bowl, as you can see there, and this is a reconstruction of it this is a reconstruction of it in its original position. Thanks to the support of the Sicilian authorities, we were able to excavate the house where it had been looted, and the recovered evidence allowed Italy to present a strong and ultimately successful case for repatriation. The excavation also produced evidence for the dating of the silver, which was buried pretty clearly at the end of the Second Punic War, that is, before Morgantina fell in 211 BC. It probably was buried that year, in fact, in the period immediately preceding the fall of the city. The treasure includes vases for banqueting. The cup in question depicts the demonic figure of Scylla, the bane of mariners in the Straits of Messina, who dwelt at the bottom of the whirlpool Charybdis and emerged to cause havoc in the shipping lanes. Here she comes out of her lair, wrapped in a monster eel stole, her canine lower parts snapping and barking as she throws a marine boulder in the direction of the spectator, who is, of course, the amused or unhappy drinker. To reach this dire image of shipwreck, the drinker, no doubt evoking Charybdis by swirling the wine in his cup, had to negotiate a version of the same axonometric meander that we saw in the Ganymede mosaic, just here. It's a remarkable rendering by a silversmith, the only example that we know of an axonometric meander represented in a silver vessel. For us to read these complex images correctly, we must attempt to recreate the dynamic experience of convivial drinking in the houses of the new Syracusan bourgeoisie. The banqueting rooms are like miniature theaters in which the old mythological subjects continue to be brought to life by clever artistic stratagems. In concluding, I return to the productive countryside, not for its economic importance, but to view it as the setting for Theocritist vision of pastoral, populated by musical shepherds, goatherds, and cowherds, and also by important divine figures who, because they are potentially dangerous, must always be supplicated. Water nymphs who live in springs that sometimes run dry, Pan, the god of flocks and herders, and Priapus, the god of the Tholos and guardian of gardens. These last two lascivious and a risk to the unwary or unwise. They make their appearance in contemporary Hironian art. The nymphs in many small-scale votives, but also in the wonderful triadic fountain relief of Syracuse and limestone found in the mountains above Messina, which you see here. A flowing pipe brought water into a basin as though through and from the solemn dancing figures themselves. And here is the opening for the pipe that led into the basin in front of the relief. Pan, we have examples of Pan in two miniature works from Morgantina that emphasize his physical beauty, a bronze relief and a small statuette, and Priapus, the god of the phallus, in the bold limestone sculpture from Syracuse, which stands not only as the earliest sculptural version of the god, but also as an expressive work of early Hellenistic realism. These evocations of rural gods remind us that Theocritist invention of pastoral was rooted in the peaceful reality of the Hironian countryside. In Idyll 7, one of his finest poems, Theocritus tells us that his expressive new genre was transmitted to human poets, not by the muses, but by the rural nymphs. Theocritan pastoral is one of the great creations of the Hellenistic era, and it is a demonstration of the inventiveness and complexity of the Syracusan kingdom of Hiron II. Thank you. And now, we turn to Sandra Lucore, who will introduce the topic of the North Baths at Morgantina.
I would like to also express my gratitude to the Getty Villa for this opportunity, to the Villa Council for making this possible to present this aspect of our work at Morgantina, and to Michael Bomford and Carol White and Claire Lyons in particular, and all of the staff at the Getty Museum that have made the organization of this absolutely seamless. And as I'll just reiterate what my colleague Malcolm Bell said, that everything that I'll show you this evening is the result of a collaborative effort. Archaeology is nothing but collaboration, and none of this would be available without the help of many, many other people that have been involved in the North Baths project along with me. Just as Archimedes had his eureka moment while soaking in a Greek bath, Greek baths themselves are today experiencing their own eureka moment. We know much more now about Greek bathing culture throughout the Mediterranean than we did just a decade ago, thanks to archaeologists who are adding to the list of known examples at a fairly rapid pace, while looking again with fresh eyes at material uncovered long ago. The North Baths at Morgantina, we're looking at them here from the adjacent hillside, looking in the direction of Mount Etna, which is hidden in the haze of the summer sky there. The North Baths at Morgantina have come along at the right moment in this heyday of the study of Greek baths, and is one of the best preserved examples from the period that saw the fullest development of Greek thermal architecture. They are testimony to an increased allocation of resources of design, construction, and technology appropriate to a more enhanced role of bathing in public during the Hellenistic period. The earliest known Greek baths are found in Greece itself and date to the 5th century BC. So by the time the practice made its way to Sicily, public baths already had a long ancestry, and Sicilian establishments are clearly linked to this long tradition. However, the inclusion of other avant-garde features not found in earlier Greek baths, nor in other Greek baths of around the same time, with some few exceptions for some features, is remarkable for what it tells us of changes in social behavior and new architectural forms developed in order to accommodate innovative forms of leisure bathing. The larger context of these thermal developments at Morgantina around the middle of the 3rd century BC is the flourishing culture of Syracuse under Hiron II, with its own similar bathing complex, perhaps the very same public baths where Archimedes experienced his moment of insight that makes his name a household word today. I'll return to Archimedes later and go now to Morgantina. For visitors to Morgantina today, the North Baths complex is the first ancient structure encountered when arriving via the modern access road. And that's this road right here. Much the same was true in antiquity for anyone entering the city from this direction, as the baths were constructed at the western edge of the city, and you saw on the plan of the overall plan of the city of Morgantina, the location of the baths in that far western edge of the city there, at the intersection of Platea B, Avenue B, one of the two major east-west thoroughfares of the ancient city, and this is Platea B right here, and West 14th Street, which runs right along this side of the building. Visitors and residents making their way to the Agora would have been confronted by this novel building with its prominent roofline with dome and vaults, just as modern visitors are impressed by the roof designed by our project architect that protects the remains of the North Baths today, this very impressive roof right here. This was a public zone of the city and the location of other civic institutions, thus highlighting the role of the North Baths as a new amenity in civic life. The North Baths are here. Across the intersection is the South Baths complex, which is incompletely excavated, and I'm not going to talk about that, but its presence is important in this area, a sanctuary here to Demeter and Kore, and we speculate on the presence of a gymnasium across the street there. Greek baths of all periods and throughout the Greek world are identifiable by the inclusion of a circular space, or tholos. So on the map of the North Baths here, this room number 5. in which individual bathtubs were used for a kind of sitting shower-like cleansing bath. One could enter this part of the building from 14th Street, here's an entrance into room 1, and descend from the changing and waiting rooms of 1 and 2 into the bathing area where individual terracotta bathtubs ringed the wall, one below each small niche provided for storage of small items or perhaps for lamps. So here's a interior view with the niches still intact on this side of the room, and you can see some of the painting of the wall. All of the walls of the public spaces of the building were painted. Here's some of the pinkish red that's still visible today. And here's one of the type of bathtub that would have been ringing the walls below each of the niches, a so-called portable bathtub, but they're incredibly heavy and not at all portable, easy to move. But here with a back seat to sit on, a little footrest here, and a circular depression at the bottom of the tub to collect the water as it was being poured over you, taking this shower-like bath that could then be scooped up and reused, and thus minimizing the amount of water necessary to take a bath here. Clearly, a room full of bathers in this environment would have made for a very sociable experience, but the bath itself was an individual undertaking nonetheless. This is a watercolor reconstruction, but we have all the parts. So here, the ladies below, each one below a niche with a little lamp or whatnot up there. The bathtubs here, the attendant pouring the water over each bather. The pink walls of the room itself. We have fragments of a figural frieze that ran around the interior, possibly Dionysiac in subject, and the dome over the room, which was painted blue and a rectangular opening in it. And I'll come back to that dome later. We've seen from my colleagues' presentation of the Agora at Morgantina that it was just at this time that the architectural definition of the ancient city reached its high point, as it benefited from close political and cultural ties with the thriving metropolis of the kingdom. This is a reflection of the broader socio-political phenomenon of the Hellenistic period of public benefaction for the common good that stimulated the embellishment of civic life in towns and cities. The earliest clear evidence we have so far of how these broad developments revolutionized Greek bathing culture is found in the bathing establishments of Hirons' kingdom, evidence for which is best preserved in the North Baths at Morgantina. There was a comparable bathing structure at Syracuse and Megara Hiblea, another town within the realm, which are essentially the same and form a coherent group. Here, going back to Morgantina, I concentrate on Morgantina because we have the most evidence here for the fullest reconstruction of the building and the use of the building. The most elaborate room in the complex featured a pool for communal bathing and hot water. So this is room 9 over here, the communal bathing pool, hot water immersion pool up here at that north end of the room. A form of luxury and leisure bathing traditionally associated with Roman baths, but which first appear in these Sicilian baths before undergoing ultimately spectacular transformation in Roman baths. So I'll just point out the features of the total plan here. Here's 14th Street, Avenue B here, the entrance up here. The building is really very coherently and logically divided into these two forms of bathing, this cleansing bathing, which has already a long history in the world of Greek bathing, and the new form of bathing over here, represented by the inclusion of the immersion pool for a communal soak in the pool in hot water. An entrance here on Avenue B into room 7, possibly another entrance here. We think that this was probably the reception room where patrons would enter and pay their fee and and get ready to use the facilities. This is a bench along the wall here. This does not exist. Changing waiting room. This large room here is one of the 2 barrel vaulted spaces that we have. Probably the room where other things that took place in a bath would have taken place. Getting massage, getting oiled up, even perhaps minor medical interventions. And from room 8, there's an entrance into room 9 through the doorway right here. At the center of the room is the hypocaust, or the big furnace. I'll be saying more about that in just a few minutes. Here is the corridor that the attendants who kept the fires going, distributed the water. The water would have been boiled in a system right here that would have fed the baths here, and also the hot water for the pool there. This is an alley behind the building, and probably this space and possibly this double room here were also functioning in relationship with the baths here. This is a large open-air basin that collected rainwater runoff into the basin or pool here. This room here is the one clearly identifiable source of water with a well there. So this is a view into room 9. We're looking in the direction of the Tholos here. Here's the immersion pool. You see the remains of the tubes of the tubular vault on the floor here, this large standing basin. This is that access corridor over here. This is a very nice elevated walkway that was just put up last spring, which allows visitors to get right into the center of the building without setting foot on any of the ancient remains. So it's quite a nice feature for understanding the building now. And this is just a view of one of our best diggers of tubes, painstakingly brushing, troweling each tube to reveal them one at a time. And took a long time to do this. The pool in room 9 was equipped with a small furnace. So here we're looking into the immersion pool, and here's the rest of the room 9 over here. A small furnace beneath the floor of the pool. So a furnace that, think away this material here. We'll be clearing this out next summer. And the furnace runs right under the floor of the pool there. Once the pool was filled with water, a steady temperature was maintained by what we believe is likely to be the earliest known example of the Testudo, a system of heating water that works by convection and otherwise is known from later Roman baths. So this is the hearth. The red is from the burning that would have taken place here. The Testudo would have been a metal element that was constructed into the wall of the pool. Here's the other side of the wall with debris from the destruction of the building filling up that hole. And it would have been sitting on the fire outside the wall and circulating hot water to keep the temperature at a more or less steady level in the pool itself. Metal gets ripped out of ancient structures. It's the first thing that happens, and we have holes all over the place from objects like this being removed once the building, after 211 BC, once the building was no longer used as a bathing complex. Next to the hot water immersion pool is a Luterian, this standing basin here, a large basin that could be used for cooling off after a hot soak. This too was a prestige item made of non-local limestone and thus imported from some distance. The facilities of this room could accommodate numbers of bathers, those in the pool itself. And here's our 2010 excavation team illustrating just how communal this communal immersion pool could be. In the pool, and others lounging on benches while waiting their turn. So here's a bench along the wall of the pool and along this side of the room itself. But even before one entered room 9, the exceptional nature of the room was intimated by the decoration of the entrance from room 8. A mosaic threshold here, a true tessellated mosaic, which my colleague just referred to in one of the houses on the outside the agora, and an arched opening above, the most elaborate doorway in the building. So here we're looking from the south into room 8. These are the remains of the collapsed vault on the floor here. Here's that mosaic threshold right here. This is the arch that would have been at the top of the door here. Looking into room 9, the large basin here and the immersion pool at the end, and you can see the red of the wall in the distance. The interior was even further elaborated as befitted this new form of luxury bathing. The typical waterproof floors were decorated with a striking pattern of inlaid white stone, marble perhaps. Walls were painted bright red, which you saw, and a revolutionary new form of roof covered the space, a barrel vault constructed using a system of terracotta tubes, which I'll return to shortly. The interior of the vault of Room 9 was painted blue and featured complex wall moldings, but the most elaborate decoration was reserved for the immersion pool itself. Above the low wall of the pool, here's the wall of the pool here, a central Doric column here and two side piers, one here and here, supported a stone architrave here with mixed orders of Doric frieze and Ionic dentils, so this same mixed order that was referred to earlier, above applied in stucco and painted blue. So this is the exterior face of that architrave. The interior face, here's just a view of how we found it in the trench. So the Doric frieze here, alternating triglyphs and metopes, and the broken dental course above. The interior face of the architrave was painted with a frieze of swans and swags, with a border of egg and dart that would have been visible only by those soaking in the pool. So this is still in the process of being cleaned, so it's a bit difficult to make out. But here's the backside of one swan, the swag, then held in the orange beak, bright orange beak of the swan behind it, the head of the swan, and the neck curving into the incrustation here, and the right wing of the swan here, the egg and dart border, which we'll continue cleaning this summer. The swan's association with Aphrodite, the premier goddess of beauty and desirability, and her own associations with bathing would not have been lost on these bathers. Earlier Greek baths, with their more modest needs for heat and water, managed with simple hearths or portable braziers. But with the expanded facilities of these innovative Sicilian baths, a more extensive heating system was called for. It's not surprising, therefore, that the earliest known evidence of a furnace in an ancient bath is found in Sicily, in the late 4th century BC bathing complex at Gela on the southeast coast of the island. This building is incompletely excavated and not perfectly understood, but what is interesting is that the bath at Gela, the earliest known in Sicily, was in its first phase indebted to the design of baths in Greece, which at the time included no such furnace. But once on Sicilian soil, the plan was revised and the building renovated to include the furnace, which was very soon after taken up and developed further still as an integral feature of the baths of Hirons' kingdom. So here in the aerial view, right at the heart of the building is this large furnace or hypocaust, which provided the hot water for the baths here, for the immersion pool here, and we know that it was paved, at least some part of the furnace above was paved, so perhaps even an early form of a heated room, a kind of sauna, though we're still in the process of reconstructing all of this, so we don't know exactly how that worked. We commonly refer to these Greek furnaces as hypocausts, using the terminology for Roman baths, but the significant difference is that, unlike bona fide Roman hypocausts, the Greek system did not include suspended floors supported by regular rows of pillars, allowing for the wide distribution of hot gases below interconnected spaces and ultimately up through the walls. Greek hypocausts are essentially large pits sunk into the ground, and you see this detailed view of the Morgantina hypocaust, with a paved surface above and a boiler system at one end. But the conceptual relationship with the more complex later Roman system is clear. Greek religious and civic architecture was bound by tradition, but baths were not, thereby freeing them up to become the focus of experimentation and innovation. The most striking feature of the north baths is the dome and two barrel vaults that covered the three main rooms of the building. So we're looking here again at room 8 with the tubes of the vault as they collapsed on the floor. These provide among the earliest existing evidence of above-ground vaulted construction, and they stand at the beginning of a period of innovative and experimental regional developments in vaulting, before the widespread use of opus caementicum, true Roman concrete, revolutionized Roman architectural design and construction. Compared to the great dome of the Pantheon in Rome of the early 2nd century AD, the dome over the Tholos of the North Baths seems a very modest beginning. But at the time, it too was revolutionary. Before speculating on the possible inspiration for this new architectural form, I'll briefly describe how this unusual system works. The dome over the Tholos, here, with a diameter of 5.7 meters, the barrel vault over room 8, here, with a span of 4.7, and room 9, here, with a span of 5.3, are of uniform construction using a system of interlocking hollow terracotta tubes. The tubes were placed front to end vertically to create arched segments side by side. Each tube is open at one end and pointed at the other, thus providing an easy join of the tubes, as well as a certain flexibility. The tube segments ran up from each side, so we see one side here. There would have been a corresponding side over here. Once set into place, they ran up from each side and were joined at the center here by a tube open at both ends designed to accommodate the pointed ends of the tubes on either side. Once set into place, the tube segments were covered with a rough mortar compound. See that in the drawing, exterior and interior, thus making them visible on neither the interior nor the exterior. A survey of early forms of vaulting from Morgantina onwards is noteworthy for the fact that all of these early experiments in a new form of roofing took place in bathing establishments in Greek and Roman contexts, clearly an indication of their increasing importance to ancient societies. The Hellenistic period was one of great originality and creativity in science, literature, the arts, as well as architectural design and urban planning. Sicily in the 3rd century BC, the kingdom of Syracuse in particular, was no exception. The inspiration for the tubular dome and vaults at Morgantina is most likely found in Syracuse, keeping in mind that Syracuse had its own baths of the same period, and also evidence for the use of tubular vaulting there. And Syracuse had Archimedes, whose mathematical investigations may lie behind this experimental technology. Archimedes' originality in mathematics is recognized especially in his non-traditional solutions to particular problems. Yet he also employed traditional methods in his studies of segments of spheres and parabolas. An argument in favor of the practical application of these calculations of Archimedes on the construction of domes and vaults is difficult to assert. The process of constructing domes and vaults is practical, requiring an understanding of the statics of objects rather than theoretical calculations. Yet Archimedes did concern himself with studies in centers of gravity, the underlying mathematical issues of which are related to an understanding of conditions of statics during the process of construction. Although there is nothing in Archimedes' extant works that speaks to this concern, the practical applications of his results may not have been lost on builders of the time, who were experimenting with a new form of architecture. The traditional scholarly view of a strict division in antiquity between theoretical and applied mathematics, between high-level and low-level practices, is now considered untenable. Recent studies of the mathematician-engineer, Hero of Alexandria, in the 1st century AD, for example, have elucidated how his adaptation of the Archimedean legacy to a range of problems of a more mechanical kind demonstrates that it's not possible to maintain the notion that Archimedean geometry was sealed off from traditions of professional problems and calculation techniques. At the time that the dome and vaults at Morgantina, and most certainly Syracuse, were being constructed and considered and constructed, Archimedes was thinking about the geometrical properties of parabolas, spheres, and cylinders and their interrelationships. The construction of the dome at Morgantina in a series of tubular arches side by side, which is what you see here, very schematic, but illustrating this point, this series of tubular arches side by side seems closely related to Archimedes' analysis of the sphere as a series of parallel segments of truncated cones, varying in radius to approximate the curved surface. And this is not an obvious way to visualize a sphere. We also know from the mathematician Priapus, another famous Alexandrian who worked in the 4th century AD, that Archimedes wrote a treatise on sphere making, apparently his only work on practical matters, no copy of which, however, is known to survive today. And Cicero, a great fan of Archimedes, confirms Archimedes' interest in practical sphere making in his description of the war booty the Roman commander Marcellus carried back to Rome after his defeat of Syracuse in 212, a mechanical globe that showed the movements of the sun, moon, and planets around the earth. Cicero's description of this work of genius, his own definition, is now taken more seriously by historians because of the recently perceived connection between Marcellus's souvenir and the Antikythera mechanism, a 2,000-year-old mechanical computer of astonishing precision and complexity, the most sophisticated mechanism known from the ancient world, designed to model the movements of celestial bodies around the earth. And this fascinating artifact was the topic of this same program last year, 2010, at the Getty Villa. To consider the tubular dome and vaults at the North Baths in reference to the sophisticated astronomy of this mechanism might be a stretch, but the point is Archimedes' own theoretical and practical fascination with spheres and related shapes. So proud was he of his achievement at establishing the ratio of the volume of a sphere to the volume of the cylinder that contains it, that he instructed his family and friends to mark his burial place in Syracuse with a tombstone surmounted by a sphere and cylinder. It's unlikely that we'll ever be able to connect Archimedes directly to the construction of the vaulted spaces at Morgantina. Yet as we gain a more accurate picture of Archimedes as a practical inventor and not strictly the aloof theoretical mathematician that the ancient sources would have us believe, we can develop deeper insights into the possible influences of his ideas, as well as the social and cultural role of science and technology in Hellenistic Sicily. In sum, the North Baths at Morgantina represent the continuation of a long tradition of Greek bathing culture, but a tradition that was radically transformed both by new ideas of what it meant for individuals to come together in public life and by an innovative and appropriate architecture that reflected these new values. The North Baths thus contribute significantly to a more nuanced understanding of Greek public life in 3rd century BC Sicily, and in the larger picture, to the history of ancient architecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bell and Sandra Lucore. My name is Claire Lyons. I'm Curator of Antiquities here at the Villa. And before we open it up to questions from the audience, I'd like to have all three of us join together on the stage and just continue this conversation a little bit. I also have to admit to you that I'm, among several others here, I'm also an alumna of the Morgantina excavation, so it's a particular delight to have my director and colleagues here with us tonight. So let's take a few minutes to explore some of these really remarkable conclusions that have been suggested here tonight. So just to open up the conversation, maybe this is a question for both Mac and Sandra. In your overview of ancient Morgantina and the wider Syracusan kingdom, I was taking notes as you were speaking, and I was truly struck by the number of times that each one of you referred to an expression of the culture, the material culture, in the terms of the first, the earliest, and it's really, extremely noticeable, the sophisticated legal and economic structures. One of the first uses of tessera for creating mosaics, the dome, and Theocritus' invention of pastoral poetry. And this phenomenon is not only a hallmark of the 3rd century, but it actually goes back to the 6th and the 5th when you see some of the largest temples in the ancient Mediterranean, the incredible wealth of Sicily, perhaps the roots of comic theater as well as truly remarkable works of art. So I wanted to ask you, from your perspective as excavators of this site, how do you account for such revolutionary innovation? And why don't we hear about it more, not only in the historical sources, but also in the contemporary scholarly literature? Mac?
I think we don't hear about it because Sicily, Syracuse, the kingdom of Syracuse fell to Rome in 212. That is, it fell much earlier than any of the other Hellenistic kingdoms died natural deaths. But Morgantina, the kingdom of Syracuse really came to an abrupt end in the Second Punic War. And Morgantina lost its population. It was given to mercenaries. Syracuse was sacked. And one doesn't like to think about the death of Archimedes in Syracuse, but he was killed by a Roman soldier. It's a little like the death, imagining the death of Einstein or someone in a circumstance of utter disaster. And I think one of the reasons that we don't hear about the importance and the cultural achievement of Hellenistic Sicily is simply because of the disaster of the Second Punic War. Why it happened, these things were happening all around the Greek world, and if one could certainly emphasize the innovations of Alexandria. Think of the library in Alexandria, or of the great poet Callimachus. And there's things were happening at Pergamon. Think of the great altar and the library at Pergamon and the invention of parchment. Lots of inventions and innovations are taking place in the Hellenistic world. But what makes it interesting for us is that it was also happening in Sicily, and it really is not much known. And so for us, these things seem striking and need to be pointed out. And I made the point that mosaics are known early in Alexandria too, and I wouldn't insist that they were invented in Syracuse. But I wouldn't insist either that they were invented in Alexandria. We really don't know yet. And I think that it's a kind of an unanswered question. But Sicily, as you point out, was the theater of innovation from way back. One can find it back in the Archaic period.
Sandra, do you want to elaborate on that at all from your perspective of?
Well, just in terms of what we see in the architecture of bathing, we have already a long history of Greek baths, but it's just so striking that something, that furnace first appears at Gela. Gela is not part of the kingdom, but it's very quickly transformed, and the building at Gela is a building in transition. And by the time we see the three baths that I mentioned within the kingdom, they already have, they're similar enough so that they already have gone through, perhaps at Gela and other sites that we don't know yet, a kind of transition period. But it's in those baths of the kingdom that we see clearly these features. There is not the possibility of vaulting at Gela, as far as we know the building now. It wouldn't work there. Based on the evidence we have, the building is incomplete. So these things are so striking as a manifestation. They're similar, there are quite close connections between the building at Syracuse and Morgantina, in particular, even more than Morgantina and Megara Hiblea. So there's some social development that calls for this change in social behavior that is manifested most clearly there, and all of the resources are collected to make that happen. And we don't see that anyplace else so clearly.
In your lecture, you mentioned that there were evidence of baths in Syracuse, and Mac, you showed a few pictures of works of art, of sculpture from Syracuse, as well as some of the metalwork of Morgantina that may have come from such a workshop. But what actually remains to us from Hirons' great city of Syracuse in this period? It must have been extraordinary. The sources tell us about the amazing Syracusia ship, this luxury ship that was constructed, loaded with grain and sent as a gift to the king of Egypt, Ptolemy. So it must have been an amazing place, but what do we actually know from the archaeology?
The most important remains in the of Hironian Sicily, of Hiron in the 3rd century, are surely the theater, the magnificent theater, which has inscriptions that refer to Hiron, his queen, his children, and the great porticos above the theater. One of the remarkable features, if you visit Syracuse and go to the theater, which many people, anyone who goes to Syracuse will surely do, is that you go up on the upper surface of above the theater where the 2 porticos were. They meet at right angles. And in the center of the larger one is an arch cut into the living rock. Syracuse is blessed with the most wonderful stone. And the arch is cut into the living rock. It's a large space, as large or larger than this rug that we sit on. And it's a proper vault. But though, of course, it's just simply cut out of the rock, so it doesn't function as a vault, but it is vaulted. And it forms a pool. And into that pool is flowing an aqueduct that is the same aqueduct that has flowed, so far as we know, since antiquity. It's bringing water from the Anapos River, about 15 miles away, through underground aqueducts straight to the theater. And it's still there. It was intended for the hot spectators of the plays during the intermissions. During Greek plays were produced in large numbers. You would see the entire Oresteia, the Agamemnon, and the other 2 plays. And so between those, in the hot sun, you could go up and get water. But that's Hironian Sicily. But there's not too much. And part of the reason, I think, is that Syracuse is still there over the ancient city. Go to the museum, and you'll see now the statue of Priapus, the relief of the Nymphs, and lots of pottery, lots of wonderful pottery. My colleague Shelley Stone, who is here tonight, is really an authority on Syracusan pottery because it is the pottery of Morgantina too, and we have wonderful examples. And you're completely correct to mention the silver. I didn't say that, and I should have, but that the silver, it was found at Morgantina, it's been repatriated to Morgantina, but it almost certainly was made at Syracuse. The forms are Syracuse, and the shapes, the shapes that we find in Syracusan pottery. So the mixed order of Ionic and Doric put together is there in the little altar, and that all must come from Syracuse. So there's lots of evidence, but it has to be put together. And maybe that's what we were trying to do tonight.
This may be a good moment to look for some questions from the audience. Staff members are coming down either side with microphones, and so if you have a question, maybe speak into the microphone because we're recording.
When was the island of Sicily first settled, and do we know by what culture it was settled?
Well, it's been settled many times. It was settled by people before the Greeks, before the Romans, going back into the mists of prehistory. But if we are thinking about classical culture, it was first settled by the Greeks in the 8th century BC. And they founded the cities like Syracuse, Gela, Agrigento, Selinus, Megara, the cities that we've mentioned today. Morgantina, as it happens, is older than Syracuse. It was founded by the people who came to Sicily before the Greeks. They were called Sicels, and they gave the name to the island. And they came and settled at Morgantina sometime perhaps around 1000 BC. And Claire knows this well, Claire Lyons, because she has studied the later phases of that first phase of Morgantina, so that the presence of Sicels at Morgantina. You should be answering this question.
No. That's the next lecture.
So, yes, and then, of course, Sicily was settled by Rome, and then it was settled by the Arabs, and then it was settled by the Normans. It's been invaded and settled by many cultures. So it's difficult to, if we're thinking about the classical world, the Greeks come in the 8th century.
A good metaphor for that is the word that you use, Sandra, with Archimedes, the fact that the evidence for his work comes to us from a codex, the Archimedes palimpsest. That is, it's a text on top of a text, and Sicily is very much a palimpsest of cultures.
My question concerns the purpose of the bath. and specifically whether there's any evidence of any spiritual or religious practices that you've come up with.
I think not, even though one of the two bath complexes is built adjacent to a sanctuary. But what seems to be clear, looking again at the evidence for Greek baths that has been known for some time already, looking at baths in sanctuaries, which in the past were considered possibly or probably, depending on how you looked at them, as having some function of ritual because of the sanctuary setting. But what really seems clear based on the broader picture we have now and the much more detailed picture of where Greek baths were all over the Mediterranean, it seems that even those baths in sanctuaries were public amenities for the people who visited the sanctuaries, for the pilgrims going to the sanctuaries, baths for them to use. We don't have any evidence of ritual use at Morgantina. The building was reused after 211. It was still standing, but it was not used as a bath building. And apparently, when the city of Morgantina was taken over or was given to the band of Spanish mercenaries, they did a clean sweep of the building, cleared the floors of most of the material, the evidence of use of individual spaces, in preparation for using it in some other way. We have some evidence of reuse, this feature right here, and possibly reuse of the furnace area. But they're putting together all of the evidence that we are day by day knowing increasingly better about Greek baths. There really is no clear evidence that these baths were used for ritual purposes, and they more coherently express themselves as public facilities that people used for bathing of one form or another.
What were the social demographics of the citizenry who got to frequent the baths? Was this for the aristocrats or for just people who were dirty or hot or what?
That's a good question, and it's not possible to answer it definitively, but we know that women use baths. We have a lot of, and increasingly a great amount of information from papyrus sources from Ptolemaic Egypt that say very specific things about a woman in a bath had scalding water poured on her by a male attendant, interestingly. So the male attendant, Egyptian name, Greek woman in the bath, who brought a case against this male attendant who scalded her with this water that was too hot. So we know that women bathed in the Greek world. Most likely there wasn't mixed bathing. And there are many Greek baths that are known now in Egypt, and many of them have a double round room. And some of the people who are studying these buildings like to see the use of one by men, one by women. Even that's not clear. That's just pure conjecture. The use of the baths is connected to the issue of ownership. And again, we know from papyrus sources in Egypt that in Egypt everything was owned by the king. But it would have been comparable to the situation at Morgantina, where it was possible to lease either land and build a bath or lease a pre-existing bath. And as long as one paid the taxes to the king, one could acquire wealth through the revenue. And so who these baths were available to is presumably all citizens, but actually we really don't know in great detail the answer to that question. But we refer to them as public baths, being open to the general citizen population. And we also know, because women are in the Greek world, women are in these facilities, that we assume that was true at Morgantina as well.
One of the features that is typical of some of the rather palatial Roman houses of the later period is the inclusion of baths in in private houses. And at Morgantina, we don't have any private baths. Or we have a possible private bath, but it's in a house that exists. It was added to a house in the late period. But during the period we're talking about, we have no private baths. And so it might be that the people who lived in the houses that we have excavated, which include small houses and large, used the public bath.
In that period.
In that period.
Mm-hmm.
What similarities and what differences might there be between the Greek bathing culture, as you have studied, and what you know of the Japanese bathing culture?
Would you like to answer that? Well, I have lived in a bathing culture for many years, and I go to baths myself in Japan. And I suppose the obvious, to me, the obvious condition of that for me is a very real understanding of the deep social and cultural significance of bathing. Japan is a very hierarchical society. The social structure is very rigid in that respect, and that's reflected in traditions of bathing, and that's reflected in bathing at home and bathing in public. As far as similarities, there are no baths in Japan that look like this. Japan is a volcanic country, so there are a lot of hot springs and thermal spas and that sort of thing. But they are communal places. They're either in the home, it's where the family comes together, and it's one of the focal points for interfamily relationships, the whole process of bathing and the whole preparation of the bath, and in traditional, before the modern period, so before the Second World War, the social regulation, so within the family and extended outside the family, was quite rigid. The new young wife coming into the family was always the last to take a bath, and she had to bathe in everybody else's dirty water. And she was also required to fill the tub, get the fire going, tend the fire, and then after all the male family members and on down had their baths, then the new wife in the family was allowed to then take her bath. We just don't know if this kind of practice, if there's any similar kind of condition in ancient Greek baths, or even in ancient Roman baths for that matter. But certainly there are similarities in that you had baths where you could just get clean, and then you had baths where you would partake, or you do partake, of the Japanese experience. Just colloquially, the first time this was really sort of brought to the forefront for me was friends or students traveling abroad from Japan, and when they would come back and talk about their trips wherever they went, saying yes, they had a nice time, it was interesting wherever they went, whatever they did, but they couldn't take a bath. Well, it didn't mean they couldn't get clean, it just meant that they couldn't have that experience. And it just filters down to a level of real identity of your place. So to have this kind of transition where you have, actually even the tub bathing, it's quite a communal experience, but still you're in your own water. You might be getting splashed by your neighbors, but when you transition from that to something that we see in the immersion pool of room 9, and then this is, of course, much more developed in the Roman context, it's something quite different. It's just a different, it's acceptable to do this, whereas before it's not only acceptable, but it's a privilege to do this. It's new and it's desirable. But one-on-one similarities between Japanese and ancient Greek baths, I can't really say anything about, but the deep meaning of this, I think, is similar.
I think that we're probably going to need to continue our conversation but I can't resist but asking you a final question, because the fascinating topic that you brought up about Archimedes and the famous anecdote that as he entered the bath and observed his own displacement of water, he realized that one could calculate the density of an object by comparing the volume and the weight. And that at that point he shouts "Eureka" and runs naked through the streets of Syracuse. And it's always been taken as
From a public bath.
From a public bath. And it's always been taken as an anecdote, or, a little bit apocryphal. But from what you're suggesting, is it possible that did the ideas of Archimedes influence architecture, or did his own observation of practical needs in daily life inspire his own theoretical work? Which is first, the practice or the theory?
Well, maybe both. As I did say, it's difficult to make this direct connection, but keeping in mind these later historical sources we have that refer to a practical application of some aspect of Archimedes' ideas, so we can pursue that further as well. And something else that I've just thought of recently in relation to this Archimedes palimpsest that you mentioned, one of the interesting aspects of that, which is very much promoted by Reveal Netz, who is at Stanford University and one of the main investigators of the contents of this Archimedes palimpsest, is his focus on the diagrams of that, because the language of ancient mathematics is through diagrams. They're not just illustrations of theorems, but they're actually evidence of the thinking. So he believes that these diagrams that are found in the palimpsest are perhaps very close to Archimedes' original language, which of course the 10th century text of the palimpsested text wouldn't be. So I'm wondering about the possibility of that, because thinking of builders who are imagining this, and how are they working with their way of visualizing this, or before actually trying to put them up, having some assurance that these vaults and domes will stay up. If somehow there might be a way of looking into further the sort of culture of diagrams at the time, because these would have been known. These were the way that mathematicians exchanged ideas. But another way to talk about Archimedes possibly directly involved in this is through the king himself. Because we know from the historical sources that Hiron is said to have gifted his cities with gymnasia, temples, the granaries at Syracuse, and possibly baths as well. And he would have commanded the resources. We know that Archimedes was in his service to verify the gold content of the crown, and to oversee the work on the Syracuse, and to maybe or maybe not make the Archimedes screw. But the king would have been in a position to do that, or some other elite members, to have the money, have the resources, have the power and influence. And in return, what the king would get was recognition, his aggrandized reputation for being able to produce something like this. So that might actually be maybe a more, from a humanities perspective, way to see Archimedes directly involved in these. But the actual mathematics on the construction of domes and vaults is a little bit more difficult to ascertain. But can I just say one more thing about
One more thing.
Because the eureka moment for Archimedes might actually not have been about that water displacement. A colleague that I have been discussing these ideas with for a year or so, a year or two, Daniele Napolitani, who teaches at the University of Pisa, historian of ancient science and mathematics. He was quite interested when he discovered that there were real vaults and domes at the time of Archimedes, because out of this palimpsest, one of the most important texts is the one called the Method, in this method, this treatise, is a very unusual shape that other people who have been studying this have come up with very convoluted mathematical ways to explain how Archimedes arrived at this shape. But when Daniele Napolitani saw these vaults, he was quite struck by the fact that they exist, and he finds it much more satisfying, much more reasonable to explain the evolution of this figure from the method as a result of Archimedes looking at real vaults and just seeing these shapes in the interconnection of two barrel vaulted spaces. So this is sort of the opposite of what I've been getting at, seeing Archimedes behind this. It might have been the other way around.
Yeah.
So this is another way to try and explore the influences, whichever way they're going.
Well, there's a lot more to talk about on this subject, and in that spirit, I think we should join with Professor Bell and Sandra Lucore for a refreshment upstairs on the upper terrace. Continue the conversation there one-on-one, and please join me in thanking both of them for this amazing day.